So this is a briefing for this year's curriculum, but just to take you through what this whole thing looks like in terms of our 10-year series. As you know, we have curated basically 10 years worth of materials for our BEC discussion. We started off a couple of years ago with the Worldview series, and that had 2 sessions in there aligning Christian market worldview for the marketplace, and then God at Work. God at Work, if you remember, was the video series. Then came this next section of 4 modules, which is Foundations for Kingdom Business. Session 3, module 3 rather, the Successful Kingdom Entrepreneur was something that you did last year. So that should be quite fresh in your minds. 4 foundations of building a kingdom business. This is what we'll be doing this year, and pretty much a follow-on from what we did last year. 5, doing business God's way, and 6, solving problem God's way. And that's something that's new and that will be coming up in the following years. Then followed by the 3rd segment, which is kingdom leadership. This is where we look at leadership issues, and we have marketplace discipleship, business lessons from the life of Joseph, God's leaders, and then finally the last segment, overcoming hurdles. I can rename this stumbling blocks in the marketplace, right? So this is an overview of what you will see in the 10 years. We are, as you can see, in the 4th module of this 10-year series under Foundations for Kingdom Business. So going straight into what's happening this year, all right? Foundations for building a kingdom business. Now, there are 8 sessions for this year. So the first one, what is a kingdom business? Now, basically, a kingdom business is really a business that honors God, that serves people, that changes lives. And of course, it has to be profitable at the end of the day. I mean, if it's not profitable, it's not sustainable, right? But I think the question we have to ask ourselves really is, why build a kingdom business? It's hard enough to be a Christian in the marketplace. Why can't we just run a regular business like any other business, whether it's a sole proprietorship, whether it's a private limited, or whatever company that you're running in whatever industry it is? Why bother building a kingdom business? Isn't that adding a layer that is going to make it even more difficult? I think if you look at the business that we are each managing, especially if you're a business owner, we spend a lot of time actually building that business and operating it. Probably 60-75% of our time, our waking time, is spent running the business. And so as we are doing that, we always tend to get caught in things, and then we turn to God and ask the Lord, help us out here. I need a direction. I need you to open the doors. But if you think about it, if God is not in your business, if you have not invited him to be a part of the business, I don't think he'll be half as interested to be involved in it. Of course, you know, being a merciful and compassionate father, he is going to help you out from time to time, but he's not going to take your business really from that one level to the next if you have not really invited him into the business. And he's not going to come into the business if it is not going to be a business that is run according to kingdom principles. I think that's something you can be sure of. So, simple reason for establishing and running a kingdom business is because you want God to be a part of it, right? So what does that mean to be running a kingdom business? Well, we've listed 7 characteristics of a kingdom business. You can see it all up there. The first 2 stems out of your own personal relationship and connection to God. Your divine calling, it's something we have covered, I think, last year, bringing in all the 5 different factors, if you remember. Your personal connection to the Lord, that's something you bring into the business as well as the business owner. Reflection of God's character, that's something critical. A life-giving culture. We'll talk a bit about this, but basically a kingdom business has to be one that builds people up. It's life-giving. It's not something that tears people down. Stewardship of resources, I think most of us will be familiar with this, but it's a very key concept in the kingdom economics. Measurable fruit, everything that goes through that should be measurable. You have to have good fruits coming out of that. And of course, the disciple-making aspect of Matthew 28 is the fulfillment of the Great Commission through the business, because the business is a great platform for you to be able to do that. We also look at what are the effective kingdom business principles when you're running this. So again, there are 7 principles that we have listed for you, and there are discussions in each of this. You can see it up there. I'm not going to go through every single one, but just take note that, of course, as we are looking at these are principles that reflect the kingdom values in our business itself. All right. So therefore, the business should reflect who we are in Christ. And finally, even as Jesus said, every good tree must bear good fruits. If it doesn't bear good fruits, it should be taken down. So if you're gonna build a kingdom business, that kingdom business must bear good fruits. And what are the good fruits? Go back and look at these principles and go back and look at the characteristics that we've listed there. So the business should be reflective of this in order for it to be bearing good fruits. Session 2 then looks at the question of ownership. Who owns the business? And we pretty much know this, but I think it's a reinforcement of the lessons that we know. And of course, taking it into the practical, right? Because I think whilst we know this mentally, practically when it comes to decision making, it's quite another thing. Stewardship, of course, as we know, is really about managing God's resources on his behalf. We are the managers. We are not owners, but we are recognizing that God is the owner of everything. The earth is the Lord's, and he has entrusted the authority to us to manage the resources on his behalf. But of course, with that authority, we are accountable to him. And of course, with good management and good stewardship, God rewards us for that. We can see that in the parable of the talents as well, right? So remember, there are rewards and there are punishments at the same time. We sometimes tend to forget about the punishments and only think about the rewards. As we consider stewardship and what we call whole life stewardship over here, whole life simply means that as we look at the different areas of our life, not just the business, but also our personal lives, our family, and stewarding the resources in each of these areas that God has placed in our hands. We see that every decision in each area, every business decision becomes really a spiritual decision. It's not just purely a decision by itself, but because we are stewarding it on behalf of the Lord, it becomes a spiritual decision. So the question, therefore, that we ask ourselves is not, God, what do you want me to do with my business? But Lord, what do you want me to do with your business? It's important to recognize that we are still just managing his business at the end of the day. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of this thing we know, we understand, it's all a very mental thing for us. But when it comes to actual decision making, we sometimes tend to forget this. When we are looking at the business acquisition of things, whether it's assets or decisions that we make, we tend to make it ourselves or together with our partners or the shareholders. We don't bring it to the Lord and recognize that this is the decision which we have to make it with God. And so to make it practical, you will see that in the annex to the session 2 notes, there is in fact a simple declaration of trust. As you know, a trust is basically recognition of who is the beneficial owner of the assets, right? So what we're trying to do is bring it down to the relevance of what we are in the marketplace, and we're declaring a trust of the assets that God has placed in our hands. You will see this format of the trust. It's a very simple thing. and sign it off. I think it's important that we do this because we know that our words are important, right? Our words have the power and the meaning of life. And so as we do this, it brings people back to realize that stewardship is not just a mental concept, but is a reality that we have to actually live out and practice. So this declaration of a trust is a simple exercise to actually acknowledge that position that we have as stewards, that we are just a trustee of the assets that God has placed in our hands. Now, in session 3, we're looking at business values. When we are running a kingdom business, the values of the business really is so critical because it really determines what kind of business we are really running. And so there are 2 parts to this whole exercise of values in this session 3. The first is business excellence. So as we know, business excellence, there is our part to it, and there is also God's part to it. Now, when we look at our part, we always know about Colossians 3:23, right? Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. This we understand, but it is really bringing that spirit of excellence into the things that we do every day. So that's why I've sort of listed down a practical plan for excellence. This is not meant to be a conclusive list. It's just meant to give you an idea of some of the practical things that we look at when we talk about excellence. Again, it's about how we apply the concept of excellence. So, for example, if you're producing products or services to your customers, it's committing to delivering these products and services to the best of your abilities. Focusing on long-term growth. I mean, we have a lot of pressure to focus on short-term growth because even through, especially this pandemic, we are surviving quarter by quarter, month by month. But we have to also, as we come out of this, we have to really focus on long-term growth because that's the thing that will enable us to see the vision of the business grow. And number 3, for example, don't stop improving what you're doing. All right. This is so important because most of the time we tend to get to a place and we stagnate in terms of our products and services, and we think that's it. That's all we need to do. But we got to keep improving because our competitors are always improving. There's always a new product or services that's coming out there. And so we got to keep improving on what we're doing for the benefit of our customers. Creating a brand of excellence which represents Christ honorably. I think those of you who understand what creating a brand entails, you will understand what this really means. And so, it's important that we create this brand of excellence which represents the product and the services that you are in. And of course, competing fairly and honorably. I personally know of many companies that don't really compete fairly. Whatever underhanded tactics they can to get one up over their competitors, they will employ it just to get ahead. I think as kingdom businesses, we need to be able to compete fairly and honorably at that. So this is our part of it, all right? This is doing everything that we do as working for the Lord. There's, of course, God's part of it, and we have to recognize this as well, that God gives work skills. He grants the favors and success in what we do. And of course, it is He who controls the promotions. And this is important to understand because this is, otherwise we try sometimes to get ahead of ourselves and we end up striving in the business. And there are things that we should do our part and leave the rest to the Lord. So business excellence is first part to it. And the second part is the ethics in business values. All right. In ethics, there are, of course, again, many things that the Bible teaches us about ethics. There are blessings for honesty. There are curses for dishonesty in ethics. There is a listing in there in your notes. I'm not going to go through that right now. But again, I just want to draw your attention to some lists that we've drawn up as some practical things to consider in the area of ethics. Again, this is not just a theoretical exercise, but it comes down to, for example, the quality of products and services that we produce. Does it actually meet product specifications? We all know that many marketing collaterals tend to overstate claims, for example. Many of us sign agreements, but we struggle to actually deliver what is supposed to be done on schedule. So, and the list goes on, as you will see there. So it's important that we bring this concept of ethics into what we do every day, the decisions that we make, the products that we produce, the services that we provide for the customers. Now, so I think the question that at the end of this session, you should be asking ourselves, does our business reflect kingdom values? If we are purpose to really develop and build and establish a kingdom business, then that business must reflect kingdom values. And of course, at the end of the day, as we have discussed earlier, a good tree must bear good fruits. So is your corporate tree bearing good fruits? In session 4, we are looking at the leadership question. And of course, as we look at leadership, there is no better model for us to look at than Jesus himself, right? So as we know, Jesus has always said that the greatest among you must be your servant, and whoever makes himself great will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be made great. So this whole area of leadership, and we talk about Jesus modeling that for us, it's always been about servanthood leadership. Of course, at the end of the day, we have to be asking ourselves, what does that practically mean? So I think it's important that we remember that number one, the leadership that really God is interested in for our lives is his leadership through us. Right? It's about his leading us. It's not about our leadership. It's not about our charisma. It's not about our street smarts, but it's really about allowing God to lead through us. And therefore, the requirement of a godly leader is really unconditional surrender of our lives to him. And that is then reflecting his leadership through us. So if we are really doing that, then it reflects the servanthood leadership that we will bring into the business. So as we see in Mark 10, whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. So it's important that as we remember this in the marketplace, as we are in our offices, if we're leading staff, for example, that our priority should be based on what is best for the people, encouraging and empowering them, and developing spiritual disciples in the business as well. Right? And there are some practical examples in there of how you can do this. Leading in the business is not about leading simply from the front, but it's really about leading through serving. And it's important that some of the discussions will take on how does this practically look like in the business. Session 5 looks at whether our business is just purely a business or is it a ministry. Yeah, we are really talking about whether our business itself can carry a ministerial purpose. So this is, of course, encapsulated in Matthew 5 about letting your light shine before others. And to be able to do that, we need to look at the kingdom culture, of the business. So the whole purpose, the vision, the mission, the values, as we discussed earlier, the people, the finances, these all have to be aligned with the kingdom culture. And the business, of course, again, as we talked about in the last session, the business needs to be managed as if Jesus were the CEO. Now, of course, some people would say, I work in an office, or I work in a business, or my business is an industry which we're not able to really be very overt about what we do. I can't go out there and just talk to my customers about Jesus. Well, there is always this argument about overt versus covert way of managing things, right? And if some of you have seen the notes in the past, we've also talked about the importance of business owners and CEOs conducting themselves in a covert way. In other words, living out the kingdom principles doing the business according to kingdom principles and not necessarily preaching about it overtly. So people will be able to see from the life, from your life, from the way you manage the business, from the way you make decisions, from the way you interact with them, that there is something different about you, that you carry basically the heart of God with you. And this is the covert way of bringing the good news to the people around you, as opposed to the overt way where you're openly talking about it. I think there are times where we need to be overt, where God creates an opportunity, but there are most of the time we have to be covert about it, especially in the beginning, because the business place is one that we build trust and we build relationships before we start talking about who we are in Christ, and that's quite important. Okay, so overt versus covert is a discussion in there, and I think that it's important that we understand how we are able to operate in both dimensions. For a kingdom business, there are three bottom lines that we want to look at. For typical business, we are looking purely at the economic bottom line. All right, we are looking at how the business is done financially. Is it profitable? We look at the GPs, we look at the net profit, we look at the return on equity. For a business to be a kingdom business and for it to have a ministerial impact, we need also to be looking at the social impact. Is the business making an impact socially? Now, it doesn't have to be socially as in impacting the world, but it can be making an impact to a certain interest group that you are interacting with as a business. Let's say the business is producing something for, say, mothers, all right, a product or a service. So that is your interest group, mothers. So, you could make a social impact to this particular interest group, and that could be on a variety of things. So it doesn't have to be purely everything that's for profit, but there can be a social element to that particular interest group. And then there's also the spiritual impact as well. Okay, remembering always the Great Commission that we have on us. So the spiritual impact is something that we always have to bear in mind. So the business as a ministry, our business can be both a business and a ministry, but being a kingdom business, the focus should be on economic, social, and spiritual bottom lines. All right. So, and is the operative word. There should be a three-dimensional focus on each of these things. What's very important, I think, in the next section is when we look at the question of success. What is success? Because how we view success is going to determine how we drive and manage the business. Right? If we are purely looking at success the way the world looks at it, which is looking at the accomplishments that we've achieved, maybe we become the best in our segment, we become the largest player in our market. Perhaps we have the best bottom line, the largest net profitability. And on a personal basis, we look at the financial and material gains that we each individually receive from the business. The world looks at all of these things and they say, wow, that's a successful guy. But I think if we are building a kingdom business, we've got to look at God's view of success. And God's view is quite different. All right. He looks at whether we've been hearing the word. He looks at whether we've been obedient to the word. He looks at whether we've been walking in his ways. And finally, he looks at whether we've been engaging in the work of the kingdom. These are how God looks at success. He has no problem with your financial accomplishments. He has no problem with the accomplishment of the accolades that you can get in the world. But I think as we have seen, the bottom line that we should be applying to the business is not just purely economic, but it's also social and spiritual as well. And that you will see it being played out in these four barometers of success which God applies. And so the notes also then goes on to discuss how do we go out and achieve godly success, that being the case. So there are 5 things that are being suggested. As you will see there, that success is a product of our work. We have to work at it. We have to be diligent about it. That God gives us everything we need to succeed. And the third thing, which is something which I think is quite interesting, and we don't always admit, but we are not all created equally. God gives different talents to different people, puts different people in different positions. And of course, we know that the more he gives to a person, the more accountability that person will have. But let's just accept it, that God dishes out different levels of talents, of things that we need to accomplish what he has called us to do. So this is actually in proportion to his calling and his purpose for our lives. He's given you a greater calling. He will give you a greater talent, and he will give you more resources you need to accomplish that. So at the end of the day, we are each accountable. Session 7, do I really reap what I sow? I think this is again something which we sometimes tend to forget in the marketplace, because we are always looking at the positives and not the negatives of things. Sowing and reaping as a biblical principle, it is of course a reaping of the law of the natural world. If you look at the times where the Bible was written, a lot of that is in the agricultural society. And sowing and reaping is something that people then understood. And that's why the Bible contains a lot of parables about what is sowing and reaping. But we also understand from there that sowing and reaping is also a law of the kingdom as well. You can see sowing and reaping to the flesh, to the spirit reaps destruction and eternal life. Sowing injustice reaps calamity. Sowing righteousness reaps reward. To me, this is kind of a carrot and stick approach that the kingdom takes towards this. Obviously, when you do the right thing, you will reap the right thing. When you do the wrong thing, well, the results will follow. Most of the time. I say this again, most of the time. Because there are certain circumstances where in the sovereignty of the Lord, this doesn't necessarily always follow 100% of. What are the biblical principles that comes to these sowing and reaping? So we know that sowing and reaping implies a weight. All right. Why does it imply a weight? Because again, as we sow seeds, we need to water it, we need to nurture it, and it needs to grow. And so the law of sowing and reaping always implies that we have to wait for some things to happen. We have to wait upon the Lord. Sowing and reaping also means that when we reap in kind to what we sow. So if you're sowing apple seed, you're going to get an apple tree and you get apple fruits. Don't expect to sow one thing and reap something else. All right? We generally reap in kind to what we sow. We reap proportionally to what we sow as well. And more than that, sometimes we reap more than what we sow, because Jesus talks about seed that brings forth 100-fold, 1,000-fold. So these are some of the principles that we can glean from this principle of sowing and reaping. But I think what is interesting is that we remember in a practical sense what was really said in Luke 6. This is a very well-known verse for all of us. And it says basically, give and it will be given to you, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, and be put into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. Really looking at that last sentence there, for with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. I think that's something that we need to bear in mind, that as we really sow out there, we will reap. And so this is the same measure that will be done. So I think the question we have to ask ourselves is really, what kind of harvest do you desire in your kingdom business? If you desire a harvest of plentiful, then you better be sowing plentiful as well. Don't expect to be reaping a lot when you're not sowing much. The final session, where is God when I need him? I think this is an area I'm sure all of us would have faced at one point in time of our life or another. When you get to a place where, when you're between a rock and a hard place, when you get to a place of desperation, what do you do, and where is God in that whole thing? So in this notes, you will see the beginning of that A little paraphrase that C.S. Lewis actually wrote during a time of the illness and subsequent death of his wife, Joy. And he writes that, God seems to be someone that's always there, that is welcoming you when things are going good, and you can always seem to find him when you look for him. But when things are difficult, and when we mean difficult, when we are talking about desperately difficult, and you're reaching out, you're trying to grasp the Lord, and you can't find him. Worse still, you can't even hear him. These are times where you are desperately needing him, but you don't hear anything. He says a door seems to be slammed shut in your face, and the sound of a double bolting inside. And after that, just nothing but silence. And the longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence becomes. So what does this mean? I think this is a session that looks at that. What does God's silence mean when you so desperately are trying to reach out for him? This notes actually takes us through a couple of things which hopes to bring to light what's happening as part of this process. Why is there silence? Because when we are going through these very difficult times, we need to sometimes remember that the trial that we're going through is not so much the trial of that situation or the circumstances that you're actually in. Whether it's a business failure, a potential failure circumstances, whether it's something that's happened, a contractual disagreement, which is a very, very big thing for your business, but it's really a trial of faith. It's a trial of your faith because it's your faith that is really being tested here. And the silence of God is really trying to bring out that faith testing process in you. Because, if God is ever present, and he is present, by the way, but he's silent in that particular circumstance. But if God seems present to you all the time, even through the difficulty, your faith is not going to be tested because you know that you always have somebody to turn back to, right? But the silence of the Lord in that particular circumstances when you really need to reach out to him, sometimes to hear a voice, whether it's a yes or a no, it doesn't matter. But to just hear a voice and to know that the Lord is with you, you don't hear anything. That is really a trial of faith. And so as you go through the notes, you will begin to see that what is this process really all about? And you will see that how this process proves your faith because it brings about a revelation of the Lord in this process. Hebrews 11 talks about faith is the confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. The silence of God in this process is really bringing that revelation for you to see where God is in this whole thing and how he's really with you, but he's staying silent because he needs to prove his presence to you. All right, so read through this process. And again, there's also the most excellent account of this whole process of trial by faith is really found in the book of Job. We are all familiar with the process that Job went through. But, after all that suffering, after all that reflection, that thinking, that introspection, the reasoning, friends coming around to advise him, that questioning, the self-doubt. And remember, all of that was in the face of silence from God. Job is finally brought to the outcome of this trial. And you remember this conversation when God appeared before him, questions him about what he understands and who God to be. And he says, where were you when I created the world? It's a process of really God bringing revelation as to who he really is and how he is so much bigger than our own understanding of who he is. This whole process of a trial by faith is something that I'm sure we've all gone through in our lives. Hopefully we don't have to go through it too much, but now it is a necessary process to really prove our faith. And in this process that he brings transformation in us into the likeness of Christ. Because through that silence, when God is not saying anything to us, it's because he wants to reveal himself to us and in us, really. Towards the end, you will see really a little poem in there which talks about how God is with us even though he is silent. And it's really in the silence that God is revealing himself to us. So those are the 8 sessions. Again, foundations for building a kingdom business.